Dubai at night sparkled like a jewel against the desert sky. The glass towers glowed, the endless rows of luxury cars whispered wealth, and the air carried the perfume of power. Beneath this glitter, however, shadows lingered, shadows of secrets, lies, and betrayals that even money could not silence. Sheikh Hamdan al-Farouqi was a man who embodied that glittering world. Billionaire, philanthropist, a name spoken with reverence in business circles and fear in private. His empire stretched from luxury hotels to oil interests, and his influence reached far beyond Dubai's borders. People admired him, envied him, and obeyed him. In public, he was the image of authority and control. In private, however, his greatest fear was not failure in business, but dishonor in his home. At his side was Layla, his wife, a vision of beauty and grace. To the world, their marriage was perfect, a glamorous couple who appeared at galas hand in hand, their photographs gracing magazines, their smiles concealing the loneliness and cracks beneath. Behind the palace walls, however, Layla lived a life of gilded captivity. Her husband's world was built on power and discipline, leaving her heart untouched, her soul longing for something more than diamonds and silk. Then there was Omar Rahman, the Sheikh's most trusted bodyguard. Silent, strong, disciplined, he was always near, a shadow who protected Layla from the outside world. But sometimes the protector becomes the danger. In the stillness of the palace halls, between the guarded glances and the stolen conversations, a forbidden fire began to grow. It was a fire destined to destroy everything. This is not just a story of love and betrayal. It is a story of pride, honor, and blood. What began as fleeting glances turned into passion, and passion into ruin. A sheikh betrayed not only by the woman he loved, but by the man he trusted most. And when betrayal cuts this deep, forgiveness is not an option. On a night meant to be ordinary, a husband walked into his private villa and found the unimaginable. What followed was not only a crime of passion, but an execution of betrayal, swift, merciless, and drenched in blood. This is the story of how a Dubai sheikh caught his wife with his bodyguard, and how their secret affair ended in bloodshed. Sheikh Hamdan al-Farouqi was not born into simplicity. He came into the world in one of Dubai's most powerful families, where wealth flowed like water and influence was inherited as naturally as blood. From his earliest years, he was taught that his name carried weight, that every step he took would ripple across society. To be an al-Farouqi was not a privilege. It was a responsibility, a burden, and a weapon. As a boy, Hamdan was schooled in tradition and discipline. Tutors drilled into him the importance of honor, loyalty, and the family's reputation. His father often repeated a phrase that clung to Hamdan for the rest of his life. Wealth can be rebuilt, but honor once broken is gone forever. The lesson sank deep into his soul. In his 20s, Hamdan rose quickly. Unlike some heirs who squandered their fortunes, he expanded them. He built luxury hotels across the Middle East, secured stakes in international oil ventures, and forged ties with politicians and royals. By his early 30s, his empire spanned continents. To the outside world, he was the very image of success. Tall, sharply dressed, commanding in every room he entered. But with power came fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of weakness, fear of losing the one thing he valued above all, control. His staff described him as a man of contradictions, generous to the loyal, merciless to the disloyal. He rewarded devotion with wealth and privilege, but punished deceit with unforgiving severity. Marriage for Hamdan was less about romance and more about legacy. He married Layla not just for her beauty, but for the image she projected, elegance, refinement, and the kind of grace that elevated his status. Their wedding had been the talk of Dubai, a ceremony that looked like a fairy tale but was in truth a contract of power and prestige. Yet beneath the tailored suits and diplomatic smiles, Hamdan was a man haunted by one obsession: dishonor. To be betrayed, especially within his own household, was the greatest humiliation he could imagine. The thought of a wife's disloyalty was unbearable. The idea of a trusted man betraying him was unthinkable. For Hamdan, trust was not given lightly, and once broken, it could only be avenged. Those who knew him privately described him as a man who lived in absolutes. There was no gray area in his world. Loyalty or treason, honor or disgrace, love or betrayal. and those who dared to cross the line rarely lived to tell the tale. To his business partners, he was a visionary. To his staff, he was a ruler. To his wife, he was a husband in name but a stranger in heart. And to Omar, his bodyguard, he was a master, a man to serve without question. Hamdan had built a fortress of wealth and power around himself, convinced it was impenetrable. But what he could never have anticipated was that the greatest danger would not come from rivals in boardrooms or enemies in politics. It would come from the very heart of his home, from the two people he thought he owned, his wife and his most trusted protector. For a man like Sheikh Hamdan, betrayal was not just a wound, it was a declaration of war. And when the time came, he would answer it in blood. If Sheikh Hamdan was forged in power, Layla al-Faruqi was shaped by beauty and privilege. Born into a family of diplomats, Layla had grown up in embassies and grand villas scattered across Europe and the Middle East. From Paris to Rome to Abu Dhabi, she was accustomed to elegance, the soft rustle of silk gowns, the glitter of chandeliers, and the constant gaze of admirers who saw her not only as a woman, but as an image of refinement. From a young age, she had been trained to be poised, graceful, and intelligent. Tutors taught her languages, finishing schools taught her manners. Yet behind the practiced smiles and polite conversation, Layla often felt invisible, seen only for her beauty, never for her thoughts. She carried within her a quiet loneliness, a yearning to be understood beyond the surface. When she met Sheikh Hamdan, she was captivated, not by his warmth, for he was a man who rarely showed any, but by his presence. He was older, powerful, and confident. Their courtship had been swift, a whirlwind of luxury dinners, diamond-studded gifts, and promises of a life where she would never want for anything. To her family, it was a perfect match, prestige for prestige, wealth for wealth. And so Layla became Mrs. al-Faruqi, the jewel on Hamdan's crown. Their wedding had been the talk of Dubai. Photographs of her in a shimmering gown graced glossy magazines. The palace gardens where the ceremony was held sparkled with 1,000 lights. To the world, it was a fairy-tale union. But to Layla, the fairy-tale ended the moment the last guests departed. Marriage to Hamdan was like living in a golden cage. Every comfort was hers, silk sheets, rare jewels, designer gowns flown in from Paris. But the freedom to live, to choose, to love on her own terms was gone. Hamdan was not unkind, but he was cold. His love was a contract, his affection conditional. He demanded loyalty, silence, and perfection. For every smile she displayed at public galas, Layla endured nights of emptiness, with a husband more devoted to his empire than to her. The palace was beautiful but suffocating. Guards watched her every move. Staff whispered in her presence. Every step she took was under scrutiny. Layla was adored by society but isolated in her own home. It was in that isolation that her heart began to ache for something simple, companionship, tenderness, the feeling of being seen as a woman, not an ornament. Her loneliness grew heavier with each passing year. She looked at her reflection in gilded mirrors and saw not a wife but a prisoner in silk. Sometimes, when she walked through the palace gardens at night, she longed for someone to hold her hand without fear, to listen to her laughter without judgment. She wanted a love that was real, even if fleeting. And then there was Omar. He was different from the polished businessmen and arrogant royals she encountered. Omar was quiet, steady, with eyes that held both strength and kindness. He was always near as her protector, yet never overstepped. At first, he was just a shadow, a presence she barely acknowledged. But slowly, in the silence of the palace corridors, she began to notice him. The way his gaze softened when she looked at him. The way he listened when she spoke, even if only a few words. In Omar, she saw what she had been missing: attention, warmth, humanity. And in Layla's gaze, Omar saw not just the wife of a sheikh, but a woman. What began as a passing awareness would soon grow into something dangerous. Layla knew the risk, knew the punishment that would follow if Hamdan ever suspected her disloyalty. Yet the heart is not ruled by reason, and hers was starving for affection. For years, Layla had been the perfect wife in public and the silent wife in private. But beneath the diamonds and silks, she was still a woman who longed to be loved. And that longing was about to ignite the affair that would seal her fate. Omar Rahman was a man built from discipline. Unlike the sheikh, who was born into wealth, or Layla, who was born into privilege, Omar came from modest beginnings. His childhood was spent in the bustling heart of Cairo, where narrow streets and crowded markets taught him resilience. His father was a retired soldier, stern but fair, who raised his sons with one unshakable rule: strength is not for domination but for protection. From a young age, Omar learned to fight not for sport but for survival. His father taught him how to handle weapons, how to defend himself, and above all, how to remain composed under pressure. While his peers dreamed of escape, Omar dreamed of purpose. That purpose came when he joined the military in his late teens. In uniform, Omar found his calling. He excelled in combat training, earning the respect of his superiors not only for his physical strength, but for his calm precision. He was not reckless, he was deliberate. To his fellow soldiers, he was the man you wanted by your side in a firefight: steady hands, steady mind, and an unwavering sense of loyalty. After years of service, Omar transitioned into private security, where his reputation quickly grew. He became known as the man who could be trusted with lives, the kind of bodyguard who would take a bullet without hesitation. It was this reputation that eventually caught the attention of Sheikh Hamdan. For the Sheikh, trust was scarce, but in Omar he saw a man molded by discipline and silence, a man who could protect him, protect his empire, and most importantly, protect his wife. Omar was hired not just as a guard, but as a shadow. His duties extended beyond the palace gates into Layla's world. Wherever she went, Omar followed, silent, vigilant, loyal. At first, Omar viewed Layla simply as an assignment. He respected the boundaries, never allowing his gaze to linger too long, never letting his emotions interfere with duty. But the palace was a place of stillness, where days blurred into nights, and Omar spent more time with Layla than with anyone else. Slowly, the lines began to blur. She was unlike anyone he had ever known. Graceful, yes, but also fragile beneath the surface. When she spoke, he listened, not out of duty, but out of genuine interest. When she smiled, something stirred within him, something he fought to bury. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was strong enough to resist. But longing is a slow fire, and no man is immune forever. To Omar, Layla was forbidden. She was the Sheikh's wife, untouchable, dangerous. He knew the cost of crossing that line: dishonor, death, the destruction of everything he had built. Yet in the quiet moments when their eyes met, he saw not a mistress of wealth, but a woman aching for connection. And in those moments, his discipline faltered. Omar was not reckless by nature. He was careful, calculating, a man who had built his life on loyalty and restraint. But in the palace, loyalty was tested, restraint was eroded, and even the strongest walls could crumble. What Omar did not realize was that the very skills that made him the Sheikh's most trusted protector would soon become the tools of his betrayal. For when he stepped across that forbidden line, he would not only risk his life, he would ignite a chain of events that would lead to a night drenched in blood. It began with glances, small, fleeting, and harmless, or so they told themselves. Layla would catch Omar's eyes lingering just a second too long when he opened the car door for her, or when he walked a few steps behind her through the palace gardens. He never spoke out of turn, never betrayed his role, but in the silence of his presence, she felt something she had not felt in years: seen. The palace was filled with wealth, but empty of warmth. Hamdan's absences were frequent, his attention consumed by business, and his love reduced to rare gestures meant more for appearances than affection. Layla's world was one of diamonds and isolation, and in that silence, Omar's steady presence grew louder. The first words that crossed the invisible line came on a warm evening in the gardens. Layla had been sitting alone by the fountain, the stars mirrored in the still water. Omar stood nearby, as always, but farther back in the shadows. She turned to him suddenly and said softly, "Do you ever feel lonely, Omar?" The question startled him. Guards did not share feelings with the Sheikh's wife, but something in her voice, fragile, aching, disarmed him. He paused, then answered carefully, "Everyone feels lonely sometimes, madam." That simple reply was the spark. From that night on, their conversations grew, brief exchanges at first, stolen moments of humanity in a palace where everything felt scripted. He would ask about her day. She would ask about his family. The more they spoke, the more the invisible wall between them weakened. Weeks turned into months. The tension grew like a storm building in the distance, quiet but inevitable. Layla found herself waiting for his small acts of kindness, holding the door a moment longer, ensuring her comfort on long drives, standing just close enough that she could feel his presence. Omar, for his part, battled an internal war. His loyalty screamed at him to stop, but his heart betrayed him every time her eyes met his. The first touch was unplanned. Layla had stumbled on the marble steps while adjusting her gown, and Omar instinctively reached out to steady her. His hand grasped her arm, firm yet gentle. For a brief second, their skin touched and both froze. Neither spoke, but in that silence something shifted. They both felt it, the spark of forbidden fire. After that moment, the distance between them grew thinner. Layla began to invent excuses to see him longer, asking him to accompany her on errands, lingering in the gardens after her evening walks. Omar tried to resist, to remind himself of the dangers, but every stolen glance, every quiet smile pulled him deeper. One night the storm finally broke. Hamden had left for an overseas business trip, leaving the palace in unusual quiet. Layla sat in her private lounge, restless, the silence unbearable. She summoned Omar under the pretense of needing assistance with a broken lamp. When he arrived, their eyes met, and the weight of months of longing collapsed in that instant. Words failed them. Layla stepped closer, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I don't want to feel invisible anymore." Omar's resolve cracked. Against every instinct of discipline, he reached for her, and in that moment the line they had sworn not to cross disappeared. Their first night together was not planned, but it was inevitable. In the darkness of her chambers, Layla found the affection she had starved for, and Omar surrendered to the love he had denied himself. It was reckless, dangerous, but for the first time in years, both felt alive. From then on, their affair became a carefully guarded secret. They met in stolen hours, when Hamden was away at business meetings or when the palace slept. They communicated with coded glances and whispered conversations, crafting a world of passion within the gilded cage of the Sheikh's palace. But secrets in a palace are like cracks in marble, no matter how small they spread. The staff began to notice Layla's sudden radiance, the way her eyes lingered on Omar. Whispers floated through the corridors, hushed yet persistent. A maid once caught sight of them standing too close, speaking in tones too soft to be professional. The risk grew with every encounter, yet neither could stop. For Layla, Omar was no longer just her protector, he was her freedom. For Omar, Layla was no longer just an assignment, she was the woman he could not resist. Both knew the danger. Both knew the punishment would be swift and merciless if Hamden ever discovered their secret. And yet, desire has a way of silencing fear, and love has a way of blinding reason. They thought they were careful. They thought they could hide. But in Dubai, secrets have a way of reaching the ears of those in power. And when that power belonged to Sheikh Hamden al-Farouki, betrayal was not forgiven, it was avenged. For months, Layla and Omar lived in the dangerous bliss of their secret affair. They thought themselves cautious, clever, invisible within the golden cage of the palace. But secrets are like smoke. They cannot be contained forever. And in Sheikh Hamden's world, even whispers reached his ears sooner or later. The first hint came not from a servant, but from Hamden's own instincts. He had always trusted Omar, but lately he sensed something different. Layla's eyes no longer followed him at dinners. She seemed distant, distracted. When he touched her hand, she would smile politely, but her warmth felt rehearsed. Hamden was not a man accustomed to being ignored, and suspicion, once planted, spread quickly in his mind. Then came the whispers. A maid, terrified but loyal to her master, quietly reported that she had once seen Layla and Omar in the gardens too close, too comfortable. Another servant spoke of hushed voices late at night, Omar seen leaving the West Wing when he should have been stationed by the gates. Hamden said nothing at first, but inside him, rage brewed like a storm. Sheikh Hamden was not a fool. He had built his empire by reading men's motives, by sniffing out betrayal long before it surfaced. But betrayal from his own wife and his most trusted bodyguard was beyond insult. It was humiliation. In his world, reputation was everything, and this was the kind of shame that spread faster than fire. He decided to test them. One evening during dinner, he casually mentioned he might travel to Abu Dhabi for a week. He watched Layla's reaction closely. Her smile flickered just slightly and her eyes darted toward Omar, so quick most would not notice. But Hamden did. The glance was enough to confirm his darkest fear. His suspicion hardened into certainty a week later. He had deliberately returned from a business meeting earlier than expected, arriving at the palace in the dead of night. As he entered silently, he dismissed the staff and walked the halls alone. The palace was dark and quiet, but in the distance, faint lights spilled from Layla's chambers. With silent steps, Hamden approached. He could hear the low murmur of voices, a man's and a woman's. His chest tightened as he pushed the door open an inch, just enough to see. There they were, Layla and Omar, not touching but close, too close. Layla's hand rested lightly on Omar's arm, her face lit with the kind of warmth she had not shown Hamden in years. Omar leaned toward her, his expression soft, intimate. It was not the closeness of a guard and his mistress, it was the closeness of lovers. The sight seared into Hamden's eyes like a brand. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, his breath heavy with fury. He did not burst in that night. No, Hamden was too calculated for that. He pulled back silently, his face carved with rage, and returned to his chambers. But in his mind, the decision was already made. Layla and Omar had crossed a line that could not be forgiven. For days, Hamden watched them closely, his anger hidden behind a mask of calm. Layla tried to act natural, Omar remained disciplined in his duties, but to Hamden, every look, every silence was evidence of their betrayal. He began to test Omar in small ways, assigning him to unusual shifts, asking questions about his whereabouts, studying his tone for cracks. Omar, disciplined as ever, answered with composure, but Hamden's fury was no longer about proof. He had seen enough with his own eyes. The Sheikh's pride was wounded deeper than any blade could cut. In his culture, a man's honor was his empire, and to be shamed by one's own wife was a dishonor that demanded blood. The breaking point came one evening when Hamden returned from a meeting earlier than expected once again. This time, he entered Layla's chambers without warning. Inside, he found her sitting with Omar by her side. They had not been intimate at that moment, but the look on their faces told the truth. Layla's startled expression, Omar's sudden stiffness. It was all the confirmation he needed. For a long, tense moment, silence filled the room. Hamden's eyes moved from his wife to his bodyguard, and then back again. His voice was low, trembling with controlled fury. "Layla, Omar, do you take me for a fool?" Neither answered. Layla's lips parted, but no words came. Omar stood rigid, his hands behind his back, as though still a soldier before his commander. Hamden's fury erupted. He struck the table beside him, sending a vase crashing to the ground. His roar filled the chamber. "You shame me in my house, under my roof, with my own guard." Layla trembled, tears welling in her eyes, but Omar remained silent, his face carved with stoicism. Hamden stormed out of the chamber that night, his rage too great to act in the moment. But the decision had already hardened in his heart. This betrayal would not be forgiven. His wife had dishonored him. His bodyguard had betrayed him. And in Sheikh Hamden's world, betrayal was paid for in blood. What Layla and Omar did not yet realize was that their time was running out. The palace was no longer their haven of stolen moments. It had become their cage. And the man who held the key was sharpening his fury, preparing for the night when he would reclaim his honor in the only way he knew, through violence. The palace, with its towering walls and marble floors, had always been a symbol of grandeur. But on that fateful night, it became a prison of fear. The storm that Sheikh Hamden had been holding within him finally erupted, and the corridors of wealth would soon echo with screams instead of laughter. Hamden had spent days calculating his next move. Rage alone would not satisfy him. This was about reclaiming honor, about making a statement that betrayal in his house could never go unpunished. Layla's tears and Omar's silence had only fueled his fury. The betrayal was not just personal. It was a wound to his pride, his name, his bloodline. The night began quietly, deceptively so. A lavish dinner had been prepared, as though nothing were amiss. Hamden sat at the long dining table with Layla across from him, Omar stationed dutifully at a distance, his expression disciplined as always. The golden chandelier cast a warm glow, but beneath it lay an air of suffocating tension. Hamden barely touched his food. He studied Layla as she picked nervously at her plate, her eyes lowered. He studied Omar, who avoided looking at her, his jaw tight. To any outsider, it might have seemed like an ordinary meal in a wealthy household, but beneath the surface, death was already in the air. When the dinner ended, Hamden dismissed the servants with a wave of his hand. The massive doors closed, leaving only the three of them inside the cavernous hall. A silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Hamden finally spoke. "Do you think I don't see it?" His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "The stolen glances, the whispers, the touch of hands when you thought no one was watching." Layla froze, her lips trembling as though she wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. Omar stood straight, his face a mask of restraint, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. Hamden rose from his chair slowly, his gaze burning into them both. "You betray me, both of you, my wife, my guard. You spit on my honor in my own house." Layla finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she stammered, "Hamden, please, it isn't what you think." "Silence," he thundered, his fist slamming against the table so hard the plates rattled. "I saw it with my own eyes. Do not insult me with lies." Omar finally spoke, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Sheikh, whatever you believe, the blame is mine alone. Layla should not." "Enough," Hamden's eyes flared with rage. "You dare speak? You whom I trusted more than a brother, you who stood by my side in battle, who I brought into my home, into my family, and this is how you repay me." The air grew heavier, the silence broken only by Layla's sobs. Hamden's hand moved to the dagger at his side, a blade he often carried as a symbol of tradition. Tonight it would taste blood. With sudden fury, he lunged forward. Layla gasped as Hamden's hand struck her across the face, the sound echoing through the hall. She fell to the ground, clutching her cheek, tears spilling freely. Omar stepped forward instinctively, his protective instincts overwhelming his discipline. "Enough, Sheikh," he barked, his voice for the first time breaking the boundaries of servitude. "If you must punish someone, punish me. Leave her be." Hamden's rage deepened at the defiance. "You dare raise your voice to me?" He drew the dagger fully now, its steel glinting under the chandelier's glow. "You dare command me in my own house?" He lunged at Omar, the blade slicing through the air. Omar dodged, narrowly avoiding the strike, but Hamden was relentless. Years of discipline kept Omar steady, but he refused to fight back with full force. He could not raise his hand against the man he once swore to protect. The struggle was brutal. Chairs toppled, the table rattled, the grand hall turning into a battlefield of betrayal. Hamden's dagger slashed across Omar's arm, drawing blood. Still, Omar stood firm, gritting his teeth, refusing to strike his master. Layla screamed, rushing forward, trying to pull Hamden back. "Stop! Please, Hamden, stop!" she cried, her hands clutching his arm. For a brief moment, Hamden froze, his chest heaving with rage. He turned to his wife, eyes blazing, and spat the words that sealed her fate. "You chose him over me, then you will die with him." Before Layla could move, Hamden shoved her violently to the ground. She struck her head against the marble floor, her cry cut short. Dazed, she tried to crawl away, but Hamden's shadow loomed over her. The dagger flashed once more, and her scream pierced the palace as the blade found its mark. Omar roared in fury, lunging forward at last. All restraint shattered. He tackled Hamden to the ground, the two men grappling with primal rage. The dagger clattered across the floor, skidding out of reach. They wrestled fiercely, Hamden's strength matched by Omar's desperation. But Hamden fought with the rage of a man avenging his honor, and Omar fought with the desperation of a man protecting the woman he loved. The clash was savage, brutal, until at last Hamden's hand found the dagger again. With a guttural cry, he drove it deep into Omar's chest. Omar gasped, his body stiffening, blood spilling from the wound. His strength faltered, his hands slipping from Hamden's grip. With one final breath, he collapsed beside Layla, his eyes dimming, his lips murmuring her name as the life drained from him. Layla, bleeding and trembling, crawled toward him, her hands shaking as she reached for his face. "Omar, please, don't leave me." Her sobs echoed in the grand hall, her gown soaked with blood. Hamden stood over them, chest heaving, dagger dripping red. His eyes, wild with fury, slowly hardened into coldness. The deed was done. His honor was restored, at least in his mind. But the price was the blood of the two people who had once meant the most to him. The hall fell silent again, except for Layla's weak cries fading into the night. And then silence. The marble floor, once gleaming white, was now stained with crimson. The chandelier above still glowed, but its light only illuminated the carnage below. Hamden stood alone in the grand hall of his palace, surrounded by death. His wife, his guard, his betrayers, his victims. And in that silence, for the first time, Hamden realized that though he had avenged his pride, he had destroyed himself. The palace was eerily quiet after the bloodshed. The echoes of screams had died, leaving only the hollow stillness of marble halls. Sheikh Hamden stood in the center of the carnage, his dagger still dripping, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had done. Before him lay two bodies, his wife Layla, the woman who once represented love and legacy, and Omar, the bodyguard he had trusted as a brother. Both stained in crimson, their lives extinguished by his own hand. For a fleeting moment, Hamden felt relief, the savage satisfaction of vengeance fulfilled. He had reclaimed his honor, silenced the whispers of betrayal, and punished those who dared to humiliate him. But as the adrenaline faded, something else crept in, an emptiness that even wealth and power could not shield him from. Still, Hamden knew the world outside could never learn the truth. Scandal was more dangerous than betrayal. If news spread that the Sheikh's wife had been unfaithful with his bodyguard, it would stain his reputation forever. No one could ever know. Within the hour, his most loyal men were summoned. Not the regular guards, but those whose loyalty was bound by blood, fear, and gold. They entered the hall in silence, their faces betraying no emotion at the sight before them. "Take them," Hamden ordered, his voice cold, detached. "No trace must remain." The men moved efficiently, as though this were not the first time they had been tasked with such a deed. Layla's delicate body was wrapped in silken sheets, her blood seeping through. Omar's body was carried away with less care, his lifeless frame still bearing the strength of the man he once was. Hamden watched, unflinching, as they disappeared into the depths of the palace. He knew where they were headed, the desert. The sands that swallowed secrets, the dunes that covered sins. By morning, the sun would rise over endless golden stretches, erasing all evidence that Layla and Omar had ever existed. The palace staff was silenced. Servants were dismissed, some bribed heavily, others threatened into submission. The story would be rewritten. Layla, it was announced, had fallen gravely ill. A sudden sickness, tragic but unsurprising, given her delicate health. Her body, it was said, had been taken away quietly for burial in accordance with tradition. Omar's disappearance required less imagination. Guards often came and went, reassigned, transferred, vanishing into other assignments. His absence would barely raise a question. Those who dared to wonder were reminded with a quiet glare. Some questions are not meant to be asked in the Sheikh's house. Within days, life at the palace resumed its polished rhythm. New servants were hired, new guards positioned. Guests arrived for dinners, business continued, the wealth of the Sheikh flowed as though nothing had changed. On the surface, the palace was untouched. But behind closed doors, Hamden was a man haunted. At night, when the halls were silent, he thought he heard Layla's voice, soft and pleading, echoing through the chambers. At times, he swore he saw Omar's figure standing in the shadows, silent and accusing. No amount of gold could quiet the memories. No banquet could silence the screams that replayed in his mind. No prayer could wash the blood from his hands. Yet Hamden carried on. He appeared at public events, his posture tall, his voice firm. To the world, he was still the untouchable Sheikh, wealthy, powerful, unshaken. But in private, the ghosts of that night never left him. And so the story of Layla and Omar vanished into the sands of Dubai, their love erased, their deaths concealed. The desert kept their secret as it had kept so many before. But those who lived within the palace walls, those who had heard the screams, those who had seen the blood, never forgot. They spoke of it in hushed whispers in the shadows, knowing that truth in such a place was more dangerous than lies. For in the Sheikh's world, betrayal was not forgiven, love was not free, and secrets were buried not just in sand but in blood.